Hey there, viewers. If you had to be stranded in space, who's the one person you'd want by your side? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm curious who you'd trust, because today we're talking about Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, who found themselves trapped aboard the ISS, and what they witnessed up there will leave you absolutely shocked. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The first signal. You can spend years at mission control, staring at monitors, listening to the rhythm of space. Those background noises, comms, system alerts, until they blur together. It's supposed to be routine, predictable. That's the whole point of the ISS. Every breath, every valve, every fluctuation accounted for. No surprises. That's why what happened during Wilmore and Williams' mission never sat right with me. I was part of the flight control team, monitoring their shifts, especially the comms logs. From the outside, it looked like everything was fine. Starliner had docked clean, their experimental checklists were being ticked off one by one, all systems nominal, nothing unusual, nothing to flag. At least at first. It wasn't until a few weeks in that I noticed something odd in the telemetry data during one of Butch's night shifts. It showed up as a small blip at first. Unusual signal activity on frequencies not assigned to ISS operations. Nothing major, could have been interference. We get anomalies like that all the time. But the thing about anomalies, they don't usually repeat. I checked the logs. Around 3:30 UTC, almost every night when Wilmore was on comms alone, the system flagged a faint external signal. No origin source listed. It wasn't bouncing from Earth, wasn't on any scheduled bands. Just a brief pulse of static, scrambled enough that the software couldn't filter it. The first time it looked like noise, he logged it. Standard procedure, but didn't escalate. No need to. Equipment glitches happen, but I kept an eye on it, out of habit more than suspicion. The second time it got my attention. Same hour, same pulse. The readings were identical to the first, no variance. If it had been random interference, you'd expect some change. But here it was, perfectly repeated, like something deliberate. I remember leaning back in my chair, listening to the faint playback, a soft crackle bleeding through the comms. Beneath it, a rhythm. Not quite Morse, not any pattern I recognized, but steady, measured, like something tapping out a message just outside our comprehension. I mentioned it casually during briefing. Got a few nods, a couple of shrugs, nobody seemed concerned. Sunspot activity maybe, some rogue satellite bouncing static our way. We'd seen stranger things. Blocked tears where it started gnawing at me. Wilmore logged it each time. Quietly, without making much fuss. He didn't flag it for high priority, didn't ask Houston to investigate further. That wasn't like him. Butch was by the book. Military background, sharp as hell. The kind of guy who doesn't let things slip. I went back, cross-referenced internal camera footage, synced it with the timestamps. And there he was, sitting at the comm panel, headset on, listening intently. You could tell by the way he leaned forward, he was focused, studying whatever was coming through. I watched the footage frame by frame, nothing unusual in the visuals, no sign of equipment faults. But the signal always came when he was alone. Day shifts, no trace. Sunita's logs, clean. Only during Butch's night rotations. A couple of days later, something else came through. Sunita sent an offhand message to Mission Control, a casual note about struggling to sleep, dreams keeping her awake. That wasn't abnormal. Everyone up there reports weird sleep patterns. Your body doesn't know night from day when there's no sunrise, no gravity pulling you down. But the phrasing caught my ear. She described seeing herself outside the station, floating, watching. It read like a joke at first, almost like she was shrugging off a bad dream. But when I matched her message timestamp to the comm logs, it lined up. Same nights, same hours, same signal interference. That's when I started pulling more data. Environmental readings, biometric logs, even minor fluctuations in oxygen flow and pressure levels. Small things that on their own mean nothing, but patterns started to appear. Blips in cabin pressure that auto-corrected before tripping alerts. Tiny delays in robotic arm movements. System cameras flickering at random, but only for a few frames at a time. I spoke to a colleague about it, one of the older guys who's been in control rooms since the shuttle era. He gave me a look, the kind where they don't want to outright dismiss you, but also don't want to go down that road. "Don't read too much into patterns," he said. "Up there, your mind wants to find order in chaos." Maybe he was right, maybe. But I kept watching. Weeks passed. The Starliner developed its now well-known thruster problems, completely unrelated, according to official reports. Their return was delayed. Everyone shifted focus to ensuring safety protocols, prepping contingencies. But every night, the signal kept coming. No origin point, no Earth-based explanation. We pushed it down in briefings, technical noise, harmless, nothing to jeopardize the mission over. One night, close to the end of their second month stuck up there, I was on late shift, just me and a couple of others in the dim control room, screens humming. The station's telemetry streamed as usual, rows of green indicators. Then it happened again. The signal pulsed, faint but sharp, bleeding through the channels. I patched in, listening closely. Same scrambled rhythm, same distortion. But this time, something underneath it shifted. A faint, almost voice-like cadence, like a message buried so deep in static you couldn't quite catch the words, but knew it was there. I stared at the screen, not moving, until it cut off suddenly. Afterward, the system showed nothing. Blank log. It's as if the pulse hadn't existed at all. I thought about flagging it, but like Butch, Instead, I went back to the internal footage again. Out of curiosity, I told myself. And in one brief clip, just a split-second flicker, the hallway camera glitched. You can convince yourself it's nothing. Compression error, frame drop. Maybe that's all it was. Except in that frozen frame, for 1 second too long, there was a figure standing in the far corner of the hallway, blurred, shadowed, watching the camera. And neither Butch nor Sunita were anywhere near it. Official logs never mention any of this. But that's where it started, the first pulse, the first signal. Something up there watching, something waiting. And we kept writing it off as background noise. Chapter 2. Systems glitch, or something else. You learn quickly in this job that systems fail, machines break. Space, for all its precision and planning, still finds ways to remind you who's really in control. We've seen thrusters misfire, software lag, even life support hiccup without warning. Every anomaly, no matter how small, gets logged, dissected, explained away. There's always a chain of cause and effect. At least, there's supposed to be. That's why when the Starliner's thrusters malfunctioned, nobody panicked. It wasn't ideal, especially not for Butch and Sunita, who were expecting to head home, but it was manageable. Boeing's engineers worked double shifts combing through the telemetry. Fuel flow irregularities, pressure imbalances. It all pointed to technical issues. Parts degrading faster than expected, maybe. Software needing recalibration, stuff that could be fixed, given time. The mission got extended, but it wasn't unprecedented. Still, something felt off. The thruster problem was just the beginning. As their days aboard stretched into weeks, more things started cropping up. Little inconsistencies, instrument panels flashing error codes for no clear reason, cabin sensors logging brief but noticeable power dips, lasting just long enough to trigger a warning, then correcting themselves before ground control could get a handle on it. It became a running joke in mission briefings. "Must be the ISS showing her age," one of the senior engineers quipped. That station's been up there long enough it wasn't unreasonable to expect wear and tear. And yet some of the logs didn't line up neatly with any known failure patterns. One morning around day 60 of their stay, we noticed the environmental readings in the US segment fluctuated. Oxygen levels dipped by just a fraction, not enough to trip alarms, but enough to register. CO2 scrubbers showed minor irregularities. Nothing dangerous, nothing serious. Still, it added to the growing list of quirks no one could quite pin down. And it wasn't just the environmental controls. Sunita started sending short reports about mechanical hesitations, robotic arms taking longer to respond, onboard diagnostic tools running sluggish. The ground team checked and rechecked from Houston, ran system overrides. The hardware always corrected itself within seconds. Still, she kept mentioning it. Small delays, fraction of a second glitches. But the logs didn't show any cause. No software faults, no hardware malfunctions. Meanwhile, Butch's logs had taken on a new tone. He remained thorough, methodical as always, but I could read between the lines. His entries were shorter, tighter, less of the usual back and forth chatter. There was a kind of clipped focus, like he was leaving something unsaid. That's when I decided to dig deeper into the internal footage archives, syncing the system glitches with the onboard cameras. I wish I hadn't. It started with a standard review, mostly empty corridors, floating equipment, the usual tight routine. But on one storage bay feed, during one of the logged power dips, the footage flickered. A few frames corrupted, digital noise scrambling the image. That wasn't too unusual. ISS cameras aren't perfect, but as I stepped frame by frame through the distortion, something stood out. Just before the footage broke, there was a shadow moving across the far corner of the bay. Not a flicker, not a reflection. A shape, brief, indistinct, but unmistakably humanoid in form. Too large, too defined to be dismissed as floating debris. The frame snapped, pixelated, and when it cleared, the bay was empty again. No record of anyone being in that area. Both Butch and Sunita logged as elsewhere. No scheduled maintenance, no reason for movement. I sat there longer than I care to admit, replaying those seconds over and over, as if staring at the grainy frames would somehow force the shape into something rational. I debated whether to flag it. Ultimately, I didn't. There's a line you don't cross in this job. You don't introduce unnecessary noise into a mission that's already tense. Technical issues are enough of a headache without feeding speculation. But I kept the file. The next few days saw more of the same. Wilmore's sleep logs, which usually showed clean rest cycles, began flagging irregularities, increased heart rate during off marks, shorter sleep durations. He never mentioned it in his direct reports, but the biometric data was clear. Something was keeping him up. I pieced it together later, cross-referencing timestamps out of curiosity. Every single wake cycle triggered at exactly 3:33 station time. It became impossible to ignore. And the kicker? Each of those nights, Butch logged minor comm interference. Nothing as blatant as before. Just brief static bursts, irregular feedback on channels that should have been quiet. He stopped noting them after a while. I think by then he'd given up trying to figure it out. Sunita's reports shifted too. She stopped mentioning the dreams, but her logs showed longer periods awake, unscheduled checks of life support panels, unnecessary manual overrides. Like she was keeping herself busy, keeping herself grounded. Isolation does things to people. We've studied it. Long-duration missions test the limits of even the most stable crews. But the thing that bothered me wasn't the usual signs of stress. It was how both of them avoided talking about it outright, as if whatever they were experiencing couldn't be written down. Meanwhile, we kept feeding them reassurances. Mission control stuck to the script. Aging systems, temporary glitches, nothing outside protocol. That's the job. Keep everything contained, keep the narrative clean. But internally, those of us combing the data knew something wasn't adding up. One night, out of habit, I pulled up the external hull logs, sensor data tracking minor impacts, temperature changes, radiation spikes. everything you expect to fluctuate in orbit. That's when I noticed another pattern. Micro-vibration readings on the hull, small, rhythmic, consistent. At first I thought maybe debris strikes, happens all the time, but debris hits are random. This wasn't. The pattern mirrored the calm pulse intervals almost exactly. And each time, around 3:33, like clockwork, the sensors picked up faint reverberations. Knocking. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? Instead, I went back to Butch's logs from that same period. No mention of it, just quiet, efficient reporting, but looking at his entries now, knowing what I know, there's something unsettling between the lines. The way they became mechanical, stripped of any personal touches, almost like he was trying not to acknowledge something creeping in at the edges. The thruster issue was still the headline, still the focus of every press release, every engineer's meeting. Boeing teams ran simulations around the clock. NASA assured everyone that things were stable, manageable. But by the time the delay stretched into its third month, no one talked much about the smaller glitches anymore. They faded into background noise. Except they hadn't. They were adding up. And the station's systems weren't the only ones showing signs of strain. Chapter 3. The Missing Data Logs. There's something particular about data loss in space. On Earth, a corrupted file, a wiped drive, a system crash, those things happen. Annoying, sure, but manageable. There's always a backup somewhere. But on the International Space Station, there's no margin for error, no room for oversight. Every byte of telemetry, every system log, every piece of data is carefully stored, transmitted, duplicated, verified. Fail-safes on fail-safes, which is why what happened next shouldn't have been possible. It started small, just a routine request from our end. One of our ground teams needed telemetry files from the previous week, standard environmental data, fuel consumption logs, comm logs. Nothing out of the ordinary. The request went up the chain, relayed to Butch and Sunita. They acknowledged receipt, said they'd have the files sent down by next shift. Except the files never came. At first, we chalked it up to human error. Maybe they missed a step, maybe the data packet glitched mid-transmission. We sent another request, more specific this time. Sunita replied politely, said she'd double-check. Hours passed. Then the message came back. Several of the storage drives on board were blank. Not corrupted. Not damaged. White. Whole swaths of system data, telemetry logs, internal recordings, gone. We ran checks from Houston. Verified uplink integrity, checked whether something had scrambled the files during download, but everything on our end was clean. The data had been erased before transmission. Someone, or something, had deleted them from the ISS itself. I remember the silence in the control room when that realization sank in. It's not the kind of thing you say out loud. There's no protocol for handling unexplained data loss without triggering internal alarms. Everyone kept it calm, professional. A few quiet theories floated. Maybe accidental deletion, maybe hardware failure. Storage drives can get old. Maybe an automatic overwrite error. But no one really bought that. Not after what had already been happening. Eventually, the higher-ups sent a more formal message, asking Butch and Sunita to investigate the missing logs themselves, maybe check for human error, the kind of politely worded request that hides how serious it actually is. Data doesn't just vanish up there. Somebody has to account for it. What we didn't know yet was that they had already noticed something strange. According to the internal reports later on, it was Sunita who found the first sign. She'd been running her own checks on one of the primary storage arrays, trying to isolate where the deletion happened. Nothing looked out of place physically, no alerts, no system flags. But when she dug deeper, she saw something she couldn't explain. One of the drives had been accessed manually. Logged in access, authorized, hours after both astronauts were logged as asleep. But no record of who accessed it. The ISS is tight, every keystroke, every login attempt logged and time-stamped. There's no such thing as anonymous tampering. And yet, there it was, Files erased during a time when, according to every log, no one touched the terminal. Sunita sent us a short, clipped report, carefully neutral in tone. She didn't speculate, just stated the facts. But when I read it, I felt something tighten in the pit of my stomach. We tried to keep it procedural, suggested they review the onboard cameras, maybe see if someone accidentally triggered a command sequence. That's when things got worse. Butch took point on the camera review, pulled the feeds, synced them against the data loss timestamps. Normally, that kind of task is dull, tedious. Hours of hallway footage, storage bays, equipment drifting quietly in weightlessness. But several of the feeds wouldn't play. Segments corrupted, timestamps skipping backward, visual glitches popping in and out. At first, it looked like standard compression errors, poor signal retention maybe, but the more frames Butch scrubbed through, the more obvious it became. These weren't random. Whole blocks of footage were unreadable, breaking down precisely during the periods when the logs were wiped. And then there was the hallway incident. We almost missed it. In one of the clearer segments, during a stretch where Sunita had been logged as in the Japanese experiment module, the camera caught movement down a side corridor. Nothing unusual. At first glance it was Sunita, moving methodically past the camera view. But when Butch slowed the footage, something didn't fit. The timestamps indicated Sunita was elsewhere at that moment, confirmed by telemetry and workstation activity. The figure walking down the hallway was her build, her posture, even the float of her hair. But when she passed out of frame, the camera glitched, and for a split second, the same figure, same face, stood at the far end of the hallway, watching. No logical explanation. Butch didn't report it immediately. I only know this because later, after everything, those of us who sifted through the recovered data found the footage flagged privately in his logs. No accompanying note, no commentary. Just saved, like he didn't trust what he saw enough to write it down, but couldn't let it go either. Around that same time, the crew health data started flagging irregularities, elevated heart rates, increased stress hormone levels, the kinds of things you'd expect on a long mission, sure, but higher than usual. Then came the headaches. Both Wilmore and Williams logged minor physical symptoms over the next few days. Headaches, dizziness, occasional nosebleeds. Each noted separately, no official correlation. NASA doctors downplayed it. Side effects of extended zero-G exposure, maybe dehydration. But I noticed something else. The storage bay footage had shown objects behaving strangely. It's hard to describe unless you've watched hours of ISS recordings, but something felt off in how equipment drifted. Usually items float predictably in microgravity, following Newton's laws, easy to anticipate. But there were frames where small objects, tools, clips, even loose wires, seemed to shift direction unnaturally, like they caught on invisible currents, like gravity itself was bending, just slightly, but enough to notice if you were looking closely. I kept going back to those frames, trying to convince myself it was camera distortion. Sunita's logs became quieter after that, less casual commentary, more structured, stripped down, like she was forcing herself to stay clinical. But every so often, she'd drop a line that made me pause. Still troubleshooting environmental feedback loops, need to verify external interference. External interference. That's the kind of phrase you don't throw around lightly. I think by then, both of them knew something wasn't adding up. Isolation plays tricks on people. That's the official line. Confinement. The monotony of orbital life, the pressure of being responsible for millions of dollars worth of equipment and experiments. It wears at the mind. Makes shadows longer, silences heavier. But you can't hallucinate corrupted data logs. You can't dream entire system drives being wiped without access. Whatever was happening up there wasn't just in their heads. And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. They weren't just fighting technical issues. They were trying to hold themselves together while something else worked quietly in the background, erasing the evidence. Chapter 4. The Phantom Docking. The ISS wasn't built to feel claustrophobic, but after months of mounting glitches, corrupted footage, and missing data, even something that vast starts closing in. You can only ignore certain signs for so long before they wrap around you like tight wire, one loop at a time. For Butch and Sunita, that tension had already been simmering beneath every routine check and system report. But what happened next, what none of us down here could make sense of, pushed them past the line. It happened during a quiet shift, late station time, early hours back on Earth. I was at my desk in the control center, sipping weak coffee, combing through secondary logs from the prior day, when the alert pinged across my screen. Not a minor glitch, not a false flag. The station's proximity sensors lit up bright. A docking signature. Every instinct in me snapped to attention. There weren't supposed to be any scheduled dockings, no resupply missions, no external crafts inbound. We had clear calendars. Every approaching vessel, every maneuver, every slight trajectory adjustment is tracked, logged, communicated weeks in advance. There's no such thing as an unscheduled arrival at the ISS. But the alert didn't care about that. It flagged a craft connecting to the port near the Harmony module. The system readout showed confirmed pressure seals, docking clamps engaged, a full handshake, as if a legitimate vehicle had latched on. Only, there was nothing. We scrambled on our end, pulling external feeds, scanning telemetry. I switched through camera angles, expecting, hoping to see some debris misread by the sensors. A reflection, a shadow, anything we could write off. But the feeds showed empty space. I watched in real time as Butch and Sunita moved swiftly, both fully suited, helmets locked. They didn't wait for more orders. They knew something didn't fit, and they wanted eyes on it themselves. The internal comms logs from that period don't capture the way the atmosphere shifted inside that station. You could hear it in the cadence of Butch's voice, clipped and precise. Sunita, methodical but quieter than usual. Neither panicked, just tense. The way people sound when something beneath them is shifting out of alignment, and no amount of training prepares you for what you're walking into. As they reached the docking hatch, something else happened. The lights flickered. Not a full outage, not enough to trip a safety protocol, but every fixture dimmed for exactly 2 seconds all across the US modules. Sunita radioed it in casually like she was logging a routine anomaly, but we felt it back on Earth. The delay, the slight echo behind her voice transmission. When Butch reached the hatch, he called out the readings, pressure differentials, small but enough to suggest something was on the other side. Sensors showed a connection. Airflow calculations shifted subtly. The numbers didn't lie. But when they peered through the porthole window, there was nothing. No approaching spacecraft, no resupply capsule, just the endless dark, Earth glinting in the distance, but no object, no vehicle, no explanation. They hesitated. We told them to hold position while we tried to recalibrate the sensors remotely, double-check data against ground-based tracking systems. But that's when the knocking started. I was listening to their comms feed live when Butch went quiet. Then, without warning, he reported faint sounds, something tapping against the outer hull, rhythmic, precise, like deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart. Sunita confirmed hearing it too, said it echoed through the structure, not random clanging but sharp patterned taps, traveling through the metal like signals. Our equipment logged nothing. No mic sensors picked up external noise, but both astronauts described it identically. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again, almost like a code. We had no answers. Every attempt to cross-reference proximity data came up blank. The connection signature vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Camera feeds showed no visual trace. When they disengaged from the hatch and floated back toward the main module, the docking indicators reset themselves. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But it had. That much was clear when we reviewed the immediate aftermath. Neither Butch nor Sunita logged formal observations beyond the standard. No speculation, no theories. But their movements changed. Sunita's next shift report mentioned nothing unusual outright, but she included a line that caught my attention. Something about running redundant checks on external seals, for peace of mind. Later she messaged ground control about strange reflections, said she thought she'd caught movement at the corner of her visor when inspecting the hatch window. When we asked if it was glare, she brushed it off, said it was probably fatigue. But we knew better. Butch didn't mention the knocking again, but his logs became clinical, stripped bare of anything unnecessary. Everything reduced to numbers, percentages, system statuses. Not the man we'd been working with for months. They were both pulling back, slipping into the kind of mechanical rhythm people adopt when they're trying not to look too closely at something gnawing at the edge of their field of vision. And there were more signs. Sunita started logging minor pressure fluctuations in her cabin during rest cycles, brief drops, lasting only seconds before stabilizing. We cross-checked all station-wide readings, nothing systemic, localized to her section. Instruments didn't flag it as dangerous, but she noticed. The isolation was starting to distort reality in ways we couldn't measure with telemetry. At one point, she reported odd sensor feedback while working in the Columbus lab, said the robotic arms felt sluggish again, hesitated for longer periods than usual before responding. But more than that, she noted something strange, a faint vibration through the station floor panels, like something large shifting, but with no accompanying mechanical events to account for it. That vibration lined up eerily close to when the docking anomaly occurred. Weeks later, when reviewing the internal video logs, another detail surfaced. One night, long after the docking event, camera feeds from the main corridor glitched again. Butch was walking past, heading toward one of the aft sections. The camera flickered, lost a few frames, then stabilized. For a fraction of a second just before the footage cut, another figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. Familiar posture, same build as Sunita, but Sunita, according to the logs, was in the US airlock at the time, running a suit check, 2 places at once. I sat for a long time, staring at those frames, fingers hovering over the keyboard, wondering what the hell we'd let unfold up there. No one wanted to talk about it. Every briefing after circled back to technical issues, thruster diagnostics, radiation monitoring. Officially, the mission was still a success, just extended, just complicated. But if you read between the lines of the logs, if you watched their body language tighten in the footage, the truth was plain. Something dark that night. Maybe it wasn't a vehicle, maybe it wasn't anything we could measure or explain, but it connected, left its imprint, and slipped away before anyone could pin it down. Butch and Sunita didn't need us to confirm it. They felt it, heard it, saw the signs no system could erase. Afterward, they stopped trusting what the instruments told them. And for the first time since this mission started, so did we. Chapter 5. The Gray Hair Phenomenon. Physical deterioration happens in space. We all know that. It's part of the job, part of the price paid for floating above the world, weightless and detached. You lose bone density, muscle mass shrinks if you're not vigilant. Your skin dries out faster. The human body wasn't built for orbit. But nothing we'd seen in decades of long-duration missions prepared us for what started happening to Butch and Sunita. At first, it was subtle, minor changes logged in the routine health reports we received daily. Butch's weight chart fluctuated slightly, a few pounds lost despite his adherence to exercise protocols. Sunita's biometric readings showed small irregularities, heart rate variability, cortisol spikes. None of it severe enough to trigger alarms, but enough that the medical team flagged it quietly for observation. NASA doctors chalked it up to stress, to the cumulative effects of months spent in microgravity combined with the extended mission uncertainty. After all, they were supposed to be back on Earth long before now. But the real signs surfaced elsewhere. It was Sunita who mentioned it first. In one of her video logs, she smiled faintly, almost like she was trying to brush it off, and casually pointed out strands of gray showing through her hair. She laughed about it, said it must be the station aging her faster. But when she leaned in close to the camera, the change was unmistakable. Not a few stray grays, not the slow, gradual shift most people expect as they age. Patches, thick streaks, silver creeping through like frost spreading across glass. The medical team replayed the footage several times. They checked her nutritional intake logs, recalculated vitamin levels, stress markers, exposure reports. Everything appeared within acceptable ranges. They ran simulations comparing her current data to her baseline pre-sleep physical. No reason surfaced. The official explanation that circulated afterward was predictable. Stress, microgravity, sleep disruption, all things known to impact biological systems. Maybe genetic predisposition accelerated by the unique conditions of orbit. But off the record, no one had an answer. And it didn't stop with her hair. Butch's weight loss began accelerating by the week, even after adjusting caloric intake, upping protein supplements, ensuring strict adherence to exercise regimens. His body continued shedding pounds. He never mentioned it outright in his logs, but the biometric data couldn't be ignored. His muscle mass percentages dropped faster than we'd seen in comparable long-term missions. He noticed, of course. He was meticulous, observant, and at some point, without looping mission control in, he started running his own blood work outside the scheduled medical checks. We only saw those reports much later. Hidden among the logs he flagged privately, there were notes, quiet, methodical records of repeated cellular anomalies. Markers indicating breakdown at a level not typically associated with short-term spaceflight. The kind of deterioration we'd expect after years in deep space. Prolonged exposure to radiation far beyond the shielding capacity of low Earth orbit. But nothing in the station's shielding suggested a breach. No significant spikes logged from solar flares, no errors in the hull integrity checks. And yet both of them were breaking down. Radiation levels inside their cabins showed minor but consistent elevation, just enough to register. Just enough to prompt us to recalibrate, double-check sensor accuracy. The shielding was intact. No leaks, no external source identified. But the readings persisted. We kept feeding them standard reassurance from ground control, blaming cumulative mission fatigue, microgravity's well-known toll. On paper, the numbers could almost be explained. Almost. Until they couldn't. Around the same time, Sunita stopped smiling in her video check-ins. Her hair, once dark and full, now streaked heavily with white. The texture seemed thinner, almost brittle, something noticeable even through the low-res feed. Her logs shifted, fewer comments, less small talk, each entry more clipped than the last, mechanical, as if she were clocking in for a job and clocking out without the pretense. The psychological signs followed quickly. Sunita's sleep reports began showing increased disruptions. She logged them clinically, difficulty staying asleep, vivid dreams, but she never elaborated. The medical staff recommended standard protocol, light exercise before rest, melatonin if necessary, but nothing helped. Later, when we reviewed private communications saved on board, we pieced together fragments of her unspoken experiences. Dreams where the ISS. No hum of equipment, no floating objects. Just her drifting alone through the modules, moving from one section to the next, hearing faint footsteps behind her. Always behind, always just out of sight. But when she turned, nothing. Not even Butch. The isolation that creeps into space missions was something we'd prepared them for. Simulations, psychological evaluations, constant communication with Earth to mitigate the worst effects. But this wasn't typical cabin fever. It was something deeper, A disconnection not only from the world below, but from themselves, their sense of place, their sense of what was real. Butch, too, began slipping. It wasn't visible in his logs. Those remained precise, almost too precise, but small details surfaced elsewhere. One night, shortly after another flagged weight drop, he sent an unscheduled video log. It wasn't addressed to mission control, just saved internally. No commentary, no narration. Just him sitting by the observation window. The Earth spinning below. At first, it looked like he was just staring. Tired, maybe, reflective. But as the video continued, you could see something shift in his face. A tightening, a slight furrow of his brow. He kept looking down, eyes scanning the planet's surface, almost as if he couldn't quite place what he was seeing. The continents looked wrong. Ask what he muttered under his breath near the end, voice barely audible. Doesn't look right. Not panicked, not frantic, just puzzled. Like the familiar shapes of land and sea, so routine after months in orbit, had rearranged themselves slightly, enough to throw him off without explanation. When we pulled satellite data and compared it to his view, nothing had changed. Earth's rotation, cloud formations, everything as expected. But that subtle disconnect was there, lingering. The following days saw more biometric irregularities. Elevated adrenaline levels, increased stress markers, despite no overt triggers. Neither of them referenced the docking anomaly from weeks prior. No mention of the corrupted footage, the erased data, but it was clear something had settled into the background, something neither of them could shake. I think by that point they stopped trusting what they were seeing. They stopped trusting what we were telling them too. Mission Control kept the public briefings upbeat, both astronauts in good health, conducting valuable experiments, adjusting to the extended mission with professionalism. But behind closed doors, we all knew better. The graying hair, the weight loss, the system glitches, it wasn't just wear and tear. It felt like something had gotten in. Something slowly peeling back the layers, one piece at a time, leaving them untethered, hollowed out, and waiting for whatever came next. Chapter 6. Contact Attempt. There comes a point in any mission when routine collapses. You can hold the line for months, stick to checklists, protocols, daily rituals, but when the cracks widen enough, it all becomes theater. That's where Butch was by the time he made the decision. The logs show it plain. Quiet entries, stripped bare. The steady reporting tone reduced to the essentials. No unnecessary details, no chatter, just numbers. You can almost feel it, the weight pressing behind every word, the things he wasn't putting down. By now, both he and Sunita were deteriorating, physically, mentally, in ways none of our medical teams could wrap explanations around. Butch's weight loss had become a closed-loop problem. No amount of increased intake could reverse it. Sunita's gray hair had turned stark, almost white under the station's cold lights. Sleep disruptions, hallucinations, minor system irregularities, all becoming constant noise in the background. And always the same time, 3:33 station time. Lights flickering, shadows slipping at the edge of the cameras, oxygen levels momentarily dipping before correcting themselves. That number showed up so consistently it almost felt deliberate, but no one dared speak that aloud. It's in that context Butch made his move. Officially, there are no unsanctioned channels on the ISS. Every frequency, every transmission route logged, time-stamped, archived. But old systems have cracks. Legacy backups, forgotten maintenance scripts, buried comlinks no longer in active use. You don't survive as long in NASA's ranks as Butch had without knowing where to find them. He waited until one of the scheduled downlink windows when bandwidth was maxed with routine data transmissions to slip into one of the old diagnostic comm channels. It wasn't connected to Houston directly, more like a vestige from an earlier era, left dormant in the archives. redundant, unused. We pieced together the sequence later from the station's backend. His logins, how he reactivated the channel, patched the onboard antenna system just enough to pulse out a transmission without tripping active monitoring. The message itself wasn't long. Short, stripped sentences, half code, half confession, barely coherent at first glance. He didn't bother naming names, no references to corrupted footage, erased logs, just enough to suggest what he suspected. Non-human interference, systems being tampered with, signs of exposure to something neither technical nor psychological. But the key was what he did at the end. Butch directed the signal not to Houston, not to any ground relay or deep space network node. He aimed it outward, toward the same frequency range where months prior he'd first picked up that faint, irregular static pulse. The same ghost signal that never showed in official records, but bled through every time he sat alone at comms. It's impossible to know if he expected a response, but he got one. Within minutes, as he sat alone in the module, Sunita logged elsewhere, supposedly asleep. The signal came back. We wouldn't have known if not for what happened afterward, how the onboard systems recorded a brief, unexplained burst across the old comm channel, tripping internal error reports. No clear language, no human signature, just garbled distortion, rhythmic enough to stand apart from background noise. But beneath the scramble, 3 words repeated, faint, fractured. "You're not alone." Butch saved the recording, tucked it into an isolated folder without forwarding it to Houston. No notation, no comment, just filed away. That same night, Sunita woke up disoriented, struggling to breathe. Her biometric logs spiked, adrenaline, heart rate, oxygen saturation momentarily plummeting. Standard procedure dictated she log any disturbances, but the only entry she made that day simply stated she dreamt something was inside. What's more unsettling is what we found on the security footage from those hours. Camera feeds flickered as usual for a brief window around 3:33, but in the frame outside Sunita's cabin, something unusual happened. For the first time, instead of a glitch or shadow, the feed stabilized for several seconds longer than expected. Enough time to see movement. Not Sunita. Not Butch. No crew scheduled in that area. But a figure, indistinct, slightly blurred, standing outside her hatch. Not walking, not floating, just standing, watching. And when the lights flickered back on, it was gone. Sunita, later in her personal logs, described hearing footsteps in the metal corridor. Sharp, deliberate, not the usual hollow echoes of movement in microgravity. But when she checked the hallway herself, nothing. Just cold silence, machinery humming faint in the background. Her sleep worsened after that. She stopped reporting it in official channels. The hallucinations, the edges of her vision catching glimpses of movement, reflections that smiled when she didn't, became constant. Every time she drifted off, she dreamt the station was empty again, but the footsteps always followed. The worst part? The footage confirmed it. Whatever she was seeing wasn't confined to her mind. Every camera during those episodes caught brief distortions, a shape just outside frame, reflections in porthole glass showing 2 figures when only one should be present. And always the lights dipped at exactly the same time, the same pattern. Back on Earth, mission control stuck to the standard lines. Stress effects, extended mission fatigue, typical psychological strain. None of us wanted to admit the mounting evidence. None of us wanted to confront what couldn't be explained through hardware failures or isolation protocols. But for Butch and Sunita, it had gone beyond that point. We knew Butch had stopped trusting us long ago. You can feel it in the way his logs thinned out, the way his reports became stripped of detail, reduced to mechanical observations. He stopped asking questions, stopped mentioning the anomalies. Because by then he was communicating elsewhere. Through that forgotten channel, through the signal that shouldn't have existed. And whatever responded, whatever sent back those words, "You're not alone." It wasn't coming from Houston. Was it coming from Earth? Chapter 7. The Return. There's something about preparing to leave orbit that usually brings relief. After months in microgravity, weeks of repetitive routines, astronauts count down to that return window like a beacon. It's the marker that the job's almost done, the mission nearly complete, and soon enough, Earth's gravity will welcome them back with solid ground underfoot. But for Butch and Sunita, when the official orders came down confirming they'd be returning via SpaceX's Crew 9, that sense of closure never appeared. On paper, the announcement was routine. After months of troubleshooting, repairs, resupply coordination, NASA had finally greenlit their departure. Public briefings framed it as smooth, a testament to their professionalism under difficult circumstances. But if you read between the lines, the private communications, the internal logs, you'd see something else entirely. Sunita didn't acknowledge the return orders immediately. Her responses stayed formal, but delayed, clipped. For days, she barely referenced the preparations. Instead, her personal log entries became sparse, fragmented. Late into one shift, she finally spoke quietly over the comm loop, off the record, voice low, almost as if she were afraid the station itself was listening. She told Butch she wasn't sure they were the same anymore. The words weren't metaphorical, not the way she said them. It wasn't about adjusting back to gravity or rejoining life on Earth. It was something deeper, something she couldn't put her finger on, as though the months they'd spent floating in that station had hollowed something out of them, as though parts of themselves had been peeled away piece by piece, left behind in the dark corners of the modules where they'd long stopped looking. Butch didn't argue. By then, the system anomalies had grown louder, impossible to ignore. In the final days leading up to departure, the ISS itself seemed to resist letting them go. Environmental controls malfunctioned in ways that couldn't be accounted for. Not minor blips anymore, but dangerous swings. Oxygen levels dipped suddenly, plummeting for brief windows before stabilizing. Artificial gravity fluctuation indicators triggered erratic alarms. We on the ground scrambled, running simulations, diagnostics, but the numbers didn't line up with any mechanical failure we could identify. Butch took it upon himself to manually inspect key ISS systems one by one. No delegation, no reliance on automated checks. He moved through the modules methodically, like a man searching for something he already suspected was there. And he found it. We didn't learn about this until much later. Buried deep in his private logs, he documented in painstaking detail hardware components that showed signs of tampering, external interference. Not wear and tear, not degradation over time. He described panels removed and resealed with surgical precision, wiring rerouted subtly, as if something or someone had accessed the station's systems without leaving standard traces. No alarms triggered, no logged maintenance entries. He took photographs, stored them separately, didn't send them to Houston, but they were there when we finally combed through the aftermath. Undeniable. That knowledge settled over the crew like lead. The station felt different those last few days. Sunita reported it in passing, the sensation that objects weren't behaving naturally anymore. Tools drifting against expected vectors, air currents carrying subtle shifts that threw off balance. She stopped sleeping altogether, logged inactive during hours meant for rest, quietly moving from module to module without clear purpose. The isolation had become something else, less like loneliness, more like the walls themselves had begun watching. Then came the night before departure. The official checklist was complete. Systems cleared, Crew 9's approach confirmed. On paper, everything was set for a smooth return. But at 3:33 station time, of course, at that same hour, the systems flinched again. Lights dimmed. Not a flicker this time, sustained, long enough to leave corridors bathed in faint, unreal shadows. And then they both heard it. simultaneously across two separate modules, each logged hearing the same sound, metal shifting, a hatch opening. Except, when they checked the panels, no hatch had registered activity. No pressure change, no door triggered. Still, the sound lingered, heavy in the air. Sunita later described seeing shadows stretching across her control panel, brief movements flickering at the edges, as if something moved just out of sight, just behind her shoulder. Butch didn't say anything in real time, but in his personal log he wrote something simple, almost detached. It's already in. Neither of them mentioned it over official comms. They went through the motions, preparing for departure like they were supposed to. Suit checks, system verifications, running through the scripts they'd memorized years ago. But if you watched the internal footage, you could see it. The way they carried themselves. Tight, brittle. Every motion too exact, as if afraid any deviation would crack something open they couldn't close again. Then, in the final minutes before leaving, Butch accessed one last system folder. We didn't notice it live. Only after the fact, combing through residual data, did we find the log that reappeared without warning, a file we thought had long been wiped in the previous data corruption episodes. No identifying title, no timestamp. Just static noise. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, a corrupted file fragment, background interference. But played at reduced speed, filtered carefully, something emerged. 3 words. Faint, broken, threading through the hiss. You left, but not alone. Butch didn't comment on it, didn't transmit it to Houston. He simply closed the file, logged out, and joined Sunita at the airlock. They boarded Crew 9 as scheduled. The station sealed behind them. And whatever it was, whatever had latched itself to the quiet spaces between their routines, to the gaps in their systems, to the shadowed corners of their minds, stayed with them. Because by then, it wasn't about the ISS. It was about what they'd carried home. Chapter 8. Regarding bail, no return to normal. The fact that bail was denied bail and brought back provides evidence of neglect and weakness. Miscarriage or death under controlled, observed Gregarian. Number 0. There's something people don't talk about much when it comes to space missions: the return. Everyone focuses on the launch, the months spent orbiting, the grand re-entry. They assume that once your boots touch Earth again, normalcy resumes. Gravity pulls you back to who you were. Muscles rebuild, minds settle, routine returns. But for Butch and Sunita, normal never arrived. It was obvious the moment they stepped off Crew 9, though the public wouldn't see it. Official coverage showed brief, sanitized footage, 2 seasoned astronauts completing another successful mission, carefully edited smiles, stiff post-landing interviews filtered through press channels. But behind the screens, those of us monitoring from inside knew different. Sunita's hair had gone completely gray, not just strands or patches, but stark silver cascading down, brittle at the ends, dull in the light. She moved stiffly, slower than baseline predictions for someone adjusting post-fleet. Her eyes, sharp and calculating in previous missions, now flicked constantly, as if tracking something at the periphery, something no one else could see. Butch was thinner, markedly so. His frame, once solid and controlled, seemed drawn in, gaunt. His medical records recorded significant weight loss despite consistent intake. Muscle atrophy that didn't align with expected microgravity recovery curves, and deeper still, neurological markers that triggered quiet discussions within the medical review boards. Neither of them complained, not outwardly. They went through debrief protocols, ran health diagnostics, gave the standard answers, but something sat beneath the surface, heavy and unmoving. Internally, NASA scrambled. The public line remained tight, praising the crew's resilience, noting minor physiological effects typical of extended missions. But the internal documents painted a different picture. Buried in classified files were the anomalies. Records of radiation spikes logged aboard the ISS, localized to their quarters, never publicly acknowledged. Equipment tampering discovered during post-mission analysis. Hardware panels showing microscopic abrasions inconsistent with routine wear. Bloodwork markers flagged as unexplainable physiological deviations, language so vague it screamed behind closed doors. Those documents never left internal servers. Government authorities stepped in quietly. Officially, it was described as standard medical observation, precautionary, nothing unusual, but in practice it became something else entirely. Neither Sunita nor Butch returned home. Instead, they were housed in a secured medical facility, location undisclosed beyond the inner circles. Every request for public appearance was denied. Interviews postponed indefinitely. When reporters tried to reach out, they hit walls. Health recovery, ongoing evaluations, mission fatigue. Behind the curtain, Butch attempted contact with external media, slipping messages through whatever channels he could find. Emails, old journalist contacts, even encrypted signals. Each time the trail vanished, access blocked, calls rerouted, authorities citing health clearance issues, confidentiality clauses. They weren't under arrest, no formal charges, but they might as well have been. Denied bail in all but name. The world spun on, headlines cycling back to earthly concerns. ISS operations continued. New crews rotated up and NASA pressed forward. But the two people who should have been celebrated, paraded before cameras, never reappeared. Weeks blurred into months. Medical reports thinned out. Updates reduced to single-line statements. Under observation. Stable. But internally more patterns emerged. Neurological tests flagged increasing cognitive anomalies, visual disturbances, memory disruptions. Sunita reported frequent migraines, described flashes of motion in empty rooms. Butch's sleep logs showed severe insomnia, coupled with inexplicable heart rate spikes during REM cycles. None of it fit the standard profiles. The final twist came quiet. One afternoon, long after the last formal check-ins, Butch sat alone in his assigned room. A hospital-issue mirror bolted to the wall, the kind installed everywhere but designed to avoid drawing attention. He stared at it for long stretches, motionless. Footage recovered later, never meant for public release, shows him leaning forward, breathing steady, face gaunt under the sterile lighting. And then, just for a second, his reflection blinked out of sync. A fraction off? Enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking. But he noticed. Didn't move, didn't speak, just stared as the reflection corrected itself. Later, in a brief, unsigned note found tucked in his medical records, 6 words were scrawled faintly, almost hesitant. You left, but not alone. No formal explanation ever followed. No press release, no declassified findings. The official story closed quietly, but some things don't stay sealed forever. And somewhere, behind locked doors, behind layers of bureaucracy and forgotten comm channels, 2 people know the truth. They didn't come back alone.